Welcome back to Plastic Models by Regular Dude, and kit number 3, the Revell Messerschmitt ME262A1A. Let us pick up where I left off working on the engine nacelles. Okay, while those are drying, I'm going to clean up the intake portion of the engine. Now, right here, you can see some ejector pin marks, and they're pretty gnarly. They're sticking out past the edge. So what I'm doing is I'm just carefully using my knife and I'm cutting them at an angle so I get it all off without compromising the edge right there. And the reason being is it does have locator pins, and I don't want to risk cutting those off in this case because that's what helps, you know, they're not quite round, and I don't want to, you know, do them upside down or crooked or anything like that. So I'm going to remove them like that. And just in looking at it from the side, run my sander on and get the burrs off. Whoops. Yeah, it looks pretty good. It's a lot flatter than it was. And then there's a little bit of a lip here where it kind of flares out a little just from the molding process. So I'm going to lightly hit that with a sander, just kind of knock that ridge off, so I don't want it flared out like that. Get the little ridge of burred up material, plastic off. Yes, that is much cleaner than it was. When you start putting paint on it and it's all weird looking like that, you're gonna have problems. There's the connection point right there from the sprue gate. I'm going to make sure that is sanded down, because that'll show up as well. Just a quick note while I'm thinking about it, you're going to find that working with different kits, depending on the manufacturer and even from kit to kit, some manufacturers' plastic will be softer or brittle or more brittle than the next brand. For example, this plastic here is pretty soft. Some plastics, and that's, you know, there's pluses and minuses for that. Number one, when you're cutting through softer plastic, it tends to cut a little bit better without snapping it off, which makes it really nice, you know, to keep from parts flying off into oblivion. Then, you know, more brittle parts seem to sand a little bit better because they actually, you know, they're harder material, so it sands a little bit better. Sorry guys, got out of frame there. It sands better because it's harder. Softer material, you can cut it easier because you have more control because you're just slicing through it, not having to put so much pressure. So, you know, just some stuff to think about and to watch for as you build different kits. You're going to have different, you know, the plastics may behave differently from one brand to another. All right. Okay, I'm going to straighten that out. This is the back portion, the exhaust portion of the engine. Sorry guys, I'm off frame here, but I need to get to the solid spot. Okay, so I'm going to clean all those little parts up, and as soon as this part finishes curing, I will sand it, and then by that time hopefully the engine nacelles will be cured enough that I can start sanding on those. And that brings me to the point. If you're wanting to, you're going to come up to a point here on step 8. You have to decide if you want to install the engine in the right side or if you want to have the engine exposed, I should say, because the engine's got to be installed because of that rear cone part. But if you want it to be exposed or not, you need to determine that and cut these access doors accordingly. So I'm going to work on those nacelles, cleaning those up, cleaning up the engine parts and all that, and then we'll come back. All right, the engine part has been done, and the cone shaped deal has been glued inside of there, and that is a pain to get it lined up, but it's in there. And so next I'm going to glue this engine nacelle together. This is the one without the engine, and I'm going to make sure I get plenty of cement down inside on the seam. So I'm using my larger capacity brush so as to get a good bead of cement going on there. And then I want to make sure that as I squeeze it together to let it start curing, that I make sure that it's lined up properly. It looks pretty good. Now if you want, and if it looks like it's not going to stick, or if there were a lot of tension on this, you could use a clamp of some. Now this type of clamp here would work very well in this case because it's got that notch to hold it, and you can put diagonal pressure to help line up that seam if one side is higher than the other. But I don't think I'm going to have to do that in this case because it looks pretty good. So I'm going to let that cure up a little bit, and I'm going to do the same to this one. Then we'll install the motor in this side here, I believe, and or the front, and move along. All right, next up, I've got some engine parts curing right now after cementing them together. So I'm going to work a little bit now that the wings have dried properly. I'm going to start working on cleaning up all of the edges. So it's pretty basic. I'm just going to take my sander and just run it along the front edge like this. And make sure that the seams are filled or smoothed out, and that there's no seam line from gluing the parts together. And again, this is one of those things that, you know, once we get the thing primed, we may discover more places to sand up a little bit. I'm going to show you another tool that I have that's pretty handy for doing stuff like this. It's this sander right here. It is a FlexiFile sander, and you can get different grits on these tapes, and they just come off like that. They're under tension. And the nice thing about them is they work really well on curved surfaces because they flex. So like if you have a two-piece gun barrel on a tank, for instance, or just like this here, there's all kinds of applications. Now, is it necessary? Probably not. It's kind of handy and kind of cool, but sometimes it can be a bit tedious because it's not that, but you know, it works pretty good. I mean, that sanded that down pretty good, pretty quickly. So it is something that might be worth looking into if you think you'd like something like this. Works pretty good. So I'm gonna keep going on this, sanding on these edges and making sure they're all nice and smooth. Then we can move on to the next part. All right, so I got the nose cone, the intake, installed for this engine, the right engine, and or I'm sorry, the left engine. So now I'm going to work on the back part here. Now first what I did is I had to do a little filling. There was a sinkhole there, so I am trying for the first time this Vallejo plastic putty to see how it works, and I'm going to sand that and this seam down as gently as possible. And then I've already cleaned up this back right here. One side is a little bit taller, so I carefully used a sander held horizontally, or a ridge sander, lightly sanded it to get it flat, so it is flat in profile there, and it mates up pretty good with the surface of the top of the wing. Now, one thing you want to make sure you remember is these two grooves here, you don't want to fill those because, as I mentioned, these are the slats and they actually extend, so those would be free moving and would not be attached to this upper part of the engine nacelle. So that actually lines up really nice. So after I get this sanded, it should fit pretty good. So using a sander, I'm going to gently sand this a little bit and see. I have to be careful not to sand down these corners rounded, so I'm going to use a smaller sander for this and sand it this way and try not to sand this back edge. So I'm going to work on that for a minute and see how it turns out. Here is my first observation on the Tamiya plastic putty. I don't think it would work good for a case like this because it is really rubbery. And trying to sand it, it doesn't really sand that great. Now, where that will come in handy, I think, because I'm not writing that off, it's supposed to be a good product, and the way I've seen it demonstrated, it has not been like this. It has been more like filling seams, and then while it is still wet, you just wet your finger and you can rub along the seam and smooth it out, and it works really well. But for a case like this, this isn't going to work because I don't know if you can't feel what I'm feeling here, but it's really rubbery because of the acrylic nature of it. So I'm going to get this off here, and I'm going to use, I think I'm going to try the Tamiya. I've got two different putties. I've got Tamiya, and then I've got the Bondo. And I'm going to try one of those. Yeah, this is not going to work. I tried sanding and it wasn't doing anything. There was no dust coming off or anything, and thought that was weird. And it was clogging up this sander really quick. So yeah, that dog ain't gonna hunt, as they say. So I'm gonna get some other putty out here and try it instead. So I've got these two here. Now, what I don't want to happen is I don't want this Tamiya putty to, sometimes it has a tendency to shrink up a little bit. So hopefully it won't do that in this case. So I'm going to use you know what? Let's do this. This is what I normally use to apply this putty. And here's what I do. I'll just give you a quick lesson in what I do on this stuff. When you open it up, if you let it sit for more than just a few seconds, it develops the skin. So I shave that off first, then I squirt out a little bit of the putty. Oh my goodness. And then apply that in the divot spot and smooth it out as much as I can to reduce the amount of sanding I have to do. Just make sure it's filled in. I think I'm even gonna get a little bit over onto this high spot there. Smooth that out thusly. Then we'll let that dry. So while that is drying, curing, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to take a look at this part here and start sanding on this to get it to where it fits nice and smooth all the way around. Alright, I've got the engine and engine nacelle installed on the wing here. Did a little bit of sanding. It wasn't enough. That dimple reappeared, and that's the one problem with a lot of these putties is sometimes you have to build it up in layers, especially on the low spot. But anyway, excuse me. I've got that part installed, and I'm going to scribe that line out a little bit better once the cement totally cures. So now it's on to working on the back, and on here I already sanded that, you know, very lightly to make it nice and smooth. Now this part doesn't fit all that great. As you can see, there's a gap underneath there, there's a gap there, and you know, it's just gonna have to be some stuff we're gonna have to live with, I think, because this is a pretty complicated part and it's gonna take some filling. So the one thing I do want to do though is this top edge right here is a bit higher than the wing, so I am going to be gently sanding this way to lower that profile a bit so it sits flush with the back of the wing. And again, there should be a seam line there, so I'm not going to worry about getting it exactly perfect and filling it in and sanding it smooth and all that. I just want to make sure that it is at least flush with the top of the wing. And once I get that done, then I will determine what I'm going to do with the rest. I'm probably going to use the putty in this little seam right here, right underneath the edge of the flap, to make that a little more flush. And this side here is just going to take some. It's going to take some filling. Probably gonna have to rescribe that line, which is going to be a real pain. But you know, you just got to do what you got to do. So I'm going to look at it, monkey around with a little bit, and see what I can come up with. All right, I got the back on the engine, so now it's just a matter of letting it dry really well. And once it dries, and one important thing, don't forget to put your little exhaust cone inside of there, which I almost did, because you won't put it in there if you don't, if you glue that back on first. So I'm going to let that glue dry. I'm going to let this putty dry, and then while that is drying, I am going to work on the other side engine. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use a sander, sand this seam smooth here, get it all nice and smoothed out. I'm going to use my sandpaper on a very flat surface on top of the instructions, but to sand these ends where they're flush, get this all smoothed out. Any of these raised panel lines that I want to remove, do those. Then I will carefully remove these ejector pin marks like I did on the other one. Then I will test fit the front, and if I need to remove anything from this front cone part, I will do that, and get it shaped up nicely to where it fits like it should on the front of the engine. Then for the back, you have the engine, and the cone part mounts inside of the engine, different than the other one. And this is designed to fit inside of here. But what I'm going to do is I am going, since I'm not using the engine, and just to make the assembly a little easier, what I'll do is I'll get this all shaped. This part here, I'll do the same thing, take off down in here and on here as I need to, test fit it on the wing, make sure this isn't too high above the wing, and just get it all kind of shaped up a little bit better. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to saw this off right behind the mounting point where this mounts on the inside of the engine, and then I'm just going to cement it in place right there like that. So it'll be where it needs to be, because you have to install the engine before you put it in here, and I didn't want to go through all that and have that additional complication, and then potentially this not fitting here correctly. So since I'm not going to be displaying this, I'm just going to chop it off and glue it on the back of that. So I'm going to work on this for a little bit and get it shaped up, and then I'll show you what I've come up with. Okay, so here I am again. I got the profile and everything sanded down on the front. I got that cemented into place, and I've pretty much got the back shaped up the way I want it. And I have a little bit more to take off on this side here to get it to where it's more flush with the rest of the engine. But that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do, and then test fitting here. The front looks pretty good. Front seam looks okay. I might sand down just a little bit on this lower edge so as to get it to sit a little more flush on the top, because the top part seems to protrude out a little bit more. Yeah, it's a little better. And the edge there is fine. It doesn't stick up too far. Get rid of that sanding burr. And then in the back, So I can pretty much glue this into place right now. I'm going to sand this down a little bit more, I think. There still seems to be a little bit of a step in the middle. Okay, that's better. There we go. See, it doesn't take much sometimes just to get that sanded down. So, and the back looks pretty good this time as far as the upper and lower. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take down this edge over on this side here to make it a little more, because this side here fits pretty nicely as far as being flush with the engine. So I'm going to take a little bit off of this side here to where the cross section matches a little better, where there's not a step. And then once I do that, I will saw this part off and glue that in there.